Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2022, the ongoing biennial conversation cycle. Today we have a wonderful guest, Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev. I will introduce her in a moment. But I also want to thank our respondent for the day, Laura Corey. She works in the director's office at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where she's a senior researcher. And most recently, she put together the fantastic exhibition of the 150-year history of the Met called Making the Met. There's a great catalog for any of you who are interested. So Laura will, in the second half of our event, respond and have some additional questions for Carolyn. And since we really like these events to be casual and short, because we know everyone's busy and tired of video things, but we still really love the fact that we can have these international exchanges, I will just go directly to introduce Carolyn. Thanks so much, Carolyn, for joining us and your busy schedule. So Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev has curated various biennials, the Sydney Biennial, the Istanbul Biennial. But I would say in terms of this type of international exhibition, her Documenta 13 really set a kind of different paradigm for Documenta. So we are all looking forward to hearing more about that exhibition. She currently works at the Castello di Rivoli, but she's also worked in New York. She was the chief curator at PS1, where she did the very memorable exhibit by Janet Cardiff, for example. I remember seeing the motet piece. It was just such a wonderful, wonderful project by Janet Cardiff. And she's done a lot of great work. She's also published scholarly books, like the book on Arte Povera, which a lot of her research has focused on. So we really look forward to having a conversation with Carolyn.
Thank you for the question, and also thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. And I feel a little bit like a fish out of water, actually, because I was looking at the participants in your program, and they're really mainly of a generation later than my own. So I feel sometimes like a dinosaur when I speak about Documenta 13 or the Sydney Biennial in 2008, or Documenta was in 2012. Istanbul Biennial was in 2015 at the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, or the traditional date used to remember that. So it's very difficult because I think the language, my situated background in being a Bulgarian Italian, born in the US and then lived most of her life in Italy, and from that earlier generation, maybe it makes difficulties in translation now, because the languages we use, so many words are markers for a whole universe that then unfolds for who listens. So some markers of mine might not unfold a universe for others who listen. But let's try, given that the internet is the era of the broken English, we might as well also have this broken translation of the generations. Your question was the specificity. Well, first of all, I don't even know right now in 2021 if this concept of the international exhibition periodic in different parts of the world even makes sense as a moment of physical aggregation of people, where different communities meet. The visitors are the local visitors, they're the international visitors who manage to come, who are not all rich globetrotters with private planes. I mean, I've seen a hell of a lot of young students with backpacks in Kassel, who did this pilgrimage. But there are various audiences. And then there's the audience of the online now, which has changed everything, and of which that's why I feel a dinosaur, because I'm not sure that I can fully really understand what is going on in terms of consciousness and experience between the local and the global, and how the local is being globalized through the internet, and the misunderstandings that occur and so forth. So I don't know, I think it's even more complicated now, and I'm glad I don't have to do the Documenta now, or Sydney Biennial. But given that we have this hour of, let's say, investigation into the past, I think the Sydney Biennale of 2008 was actually very important for forming certain numbers of ideas that came more out during the Documenta, for sure. The Sydney Biennale, but I also believe that everything is entangled. So, which is both indigenous philosophies of a non-linear time, but also quantum physics. I mean, that's clear. So everything is entangled, and there really isn't any before and after or any beginning. Also, butterfly effect is what it is. So I actually went to Sydney the first time in 2002 to install an Arte Povera exhibition coming from the Castello di Rivoli, where I was a chief curator after PS1. And for whatever reason, which I think is pretty clear, but for whatever reason, Arte Povera became of an interest to a certain number of parts and places around the world that were somehow rejecting minimalism and pop art at the time. And they felt more affinity. If you have to pull something out of Western art history of the second half of the 20th century, it wasn't Joseph Beuys at the time, because Beuys was being taken apart by feminist people and so forth. There was no recovery of Beuys, as somehow a little bit is happening. But the colleagues at the same time of Beuys in the south of the Mediterranean area of Europe, so Arte Povera, which were kind of a Baroque contemporary movement. Baroque in the sense that everything is circular, and art historical things from the past mix with a vision of phenomenological presence in the here and now, and the processes of transition and metamorphosis between materials which are chemical and which are atmospheric and so on. All of this layered together seemed to make more sense, I think, at the time in contexts like Australia or India or Latin America or Southeast Asia than other so-called Western or global North movements, because there was something you could talk about. You know, you could talk about storytelling, you could talk about narrative, you could talk about layering of the past and present, you could talk about bark, you could talk about when blue turns into green, you know, and so on. And you could talk about a certain number of poetic moments in life, which was not derived from a rationalist approach of Descartesian approach. So I took this Arte Povera to Sydney. And I think after that, that's one of the reasons that in 2000 and whatever, 6 or 7, I was nominated to compete, because I've done so many damn competitions in my life, Pedro. It's like unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And if I have time, I'll tell you about the Documenta one. That's like, you can have a heart attack getting Documenta. But anyway.
I think we should all do a series where we talk about the things we were never allowed to do, right? because
Well,
our
that's interesting. But the competitions are a very interesting thing. I mean, how you deal, it's a very interesting thing. How you deal with different contexts, what you say, you don't say, why you go into certain depth in certain areas. But anyway, for whatever reason, I got this nomination, and it was about the concept of upside down in a way, and of backwards, and of the loop. It was basically an investigation into one question, which is, why is it that artists who have been revolutionary in their artistic practice and therefore in terms of materials, form, structure, technique, and spacing different ideas of revolutionariness, have also at the same time investigated forms that had to do with reversal, inversion, repetition, and so forth, and were also in their private lives rather revolutionary, so often engaged politically and so forth. So the exhibition went from, you know, the idea of the Rodchenko Mobile to the idea of Michael Rakovitz doing the Tatlin Tower as an activist art project to actually stop, which he achieved. So it wasn't just a metaphor, it actually stopped as something terrible from happening, which is that Redfern, the neighborhood, would have been destroyed and gentrified. And Redfern is an area, a very important indigenous area of downtown Sydney, where corroborees, the meetings have been taking place since 40,000 years. So his action, which maybe later we can describe, actually had a practical effect of stopping a project. So, and Redfern still is what it is, an indigenous neighborhood of downtown Sydney. But alongside that, there were great precedents to Documenta, also in terms of artists, because I'm kind of boring in the sense that I often invite the same artists to different exhibitions because we live a life together. It's really about a life. It's not about the exhibition. It's about how you can traverse 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, having conversations and understanding the world as it changes with the same people, yet at the same time being very open. So every exhibition that I've done has involved artists that have been with me before, and then new things that I've come across over time. And I try to keep that balance. So in Sydney, of course, one of the most important projects was that of a very young artist called Pierre Huyghe, who took out 2,000 chairs from the Sydney Opera House and brought in 2,000 trees in actual earth. So they weren't chopped, there was no killing of plants, and created this other story, this other narration of a return to one of the most ancient forests and ecosystems on the planet, which is in the north of Queensland. And it lasted only 48 hours, but it was almost like a land art project in its scope and in its monumentality. It lasted 48 hours, the time to deinstall the Sydney Opera House, put the forest in, have the one night, it was the first time people in Sydney could go to the Opera House without paying a lot of money. And I remember lines, lining up, queuing up around the whole neighborhood all night, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m., became this ritual. And it lasted the duration of a very large candle. And then it just was taken down and nothing is left except a kind of work, which is a documentation of the work, but it's a video, so there's nothing to do. But that is the direct precedent to the compost in the gardens of the Documenta.
Yeah, in fact, I was thinking, it's because you like working with the same artist and developing this complex relationship, as we kind of discussed Documenta, and Pierre Huyghe's piece there was fantastic. And it's so memorable to me. Like, it was so big and yet it could disappear to some audience members. They didn't even know they were walking through an artwork. They didn't know that the dog was part of it, this strange dog and so on. And it was just fantastic. But I'm also hoping you can tell people a little bit how you think, because you mentioned this idea of the Baroque, right? One of the things that I think to me stands out about how you curate is that you have this really wide understanding of historical art. I mean, so many contemporary art shows are presentist. They really only look at what's trendy in the now or what. But for example, I loved seeing Hannah Regan's work in your Documenta, Alighiero Boetti. And to have these artists in conversation with Pierre was so. How do you go about weaving the history with the present?
Well, I don't. It just happens. I mean, first of all, I work a lot in collaboration. So contrary to many of the men who have directed Documenta, I really make a team. But it was like that in Sydney too, and it was like that in Documenta. They were called agents, and I believe it was Marta Kuzma, who was in Oka at the time in Norway. And she introduced me in one of my trips to Norway because I was going to go see the Global Seed Vault, the seed bank in the north of Norway. And we went with Amar Kanvar, who was another young artist at the time. I mean, these are all people that are, but we weren't always this age. So Amar Kanvar and I and Marta were going to this global seed bank because I wanted to see if it was real. You know, I wanted to see if actually, if it was an invention for the internet or for the, like a press thing, fake news, or if actually there were seeds there, and why. And I was divided on the question of the ecology of the politics of keeping seeds, because if you have a large concentration of seeds in one bank, it can be very dangerous because you can actually map the genetic content and control a lot of the food in future. And so I'm more for small seed banks that are local in different parts of the world. But at the same time, I understood that Monsanto, you know, could not go into that to do their research and so forth. So, but I just wanted to check it out. What I found out, and I'll get to Hanari again, what I found out was that it was real, but it was also fake, because if the electricity gets cut, it's not cold enough. It doesn't go to -20 in the deep of the mountain. It actually, so the seeds will not last very long. So it's actually of no purpose if there was World War III. I don't know if in the meantime they figured out some system, but as it is now, it's not deep enough in the mountain so that it can keep -20 at necessary. So I was up there, and at the time there was, it was shortly after un attentato. How you say un attentato? Attack.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There was a kind of a fascist attack on the parliament in the capital of Norway, Oslo. And one of the tapestries of Hannah Regan that lies there, she was an amazing woman. She was an anti-Nazi woman who had been making art, and these weavings, these tapestries were put outside her balconies, even when the German troops were going through the town. And so it was an incredible story of the stupidity of people who don't look, who, you know, don't look at what's being represented and just think it's a blanket that some woman has put outside the window. And that lack of attention allows for a lot of freedom and a lot of acts of radical freedom that are also personal acts. So Hannah Regan became very important to me. And I wanted her because of the German history of Documenta, which now I'll tell you a little bit about the Documenta in my version of it. But of course, it's born out of the catastrophe of World War II and Europe and Nazi fascism. Therefore, I really wanted that in the Fridericianum in the tower. But there was a very precise structure between Goshka Machuga's tapestries done, the one done about the Afghanistan community was in Kassel. The one done about the Kassel community was in Afghanistan. The two halves have later been put together, but there was only one half in the Documenta, and under was the Hannah Regan, and under was the brain. So there were a lot of, I mean, if you want to ask what I do, I spend a lot of time thinking about the symbolic order within, not the symbolic order in the sense of Lacan, I think about that too, but the symbolic structure that is set up, which is often invisible to most visitors. But I think in the subconscious, it enters, you know, whether you see this first and then that, creates like phrases and sentences, and it creates forms of experience and forms of knowledge that often can avoid certain patterns and structures.
Yeah, and in fact, what I remember in terms of that idea of the brain and the history of Documenta. Sorry, yes, of course. If I had known, I would have brought mine, although it's noon here. It's a bit early. I mean, it's what. But, you know, I remember while walking through the so-called brains of the Fridericianum, like there's just encountering that Caderartia installation, you know, this really powerful piece. And
yeah, that was on the second floor. Yeah, that was on the second floor to the right, just before. It was very important that it be there because it was not far. Caderartia's archive, let's say, around decolonization and issues in North Africa, that was very near Cambodian artists, and also not far from the Aboriginals, to go back to Sydney, not far from the room where Charlotte Solomon drawings were installed by Anna Bogigian, whose images you see behind me. So that whole structure of North Africa, Afghanistan. So you ask me how it works. It doesn't work art historically. It works historically. My mother was an archaeologist, and an object has a kind of story attached to it, which has a lot to do with the social, economic, industrial, political context. So it works historically. I mean, what objects or what materials are like symbols for a particular moment in history in a particular place where I want to make a connection. So if I can, if you allow me, I would like to tell you this main structure of the documento. Yeah, because the main structure, it was called the dance was frenetic and so forth. There's a long sentence that comes from a radio play from one of the Bader Meinhof, and it has to do with a place very near the Friedrichshain Castle, outside Castle, called Breitenau, which had been a Nazi prison, but also in the 1950s, just after the war, became a normalization center for bad women, bad girls, you know, girls that committed some sort of crime, like getting pregnant without being married or something. So it was a reformatory. And there had been this play, and that title anyway came from that. So what I decided to do, because of it being a dance, was to make a choreography. In other words, I did not structure it around concepts, but positions. So what position does the artist take vis-a-vis the world? So it's a very within the artist thing. And so I thought that there are four main positions. One is the position of being on stage. It's the more normal one. You know, you're doing an exhibition, you're on stage, you're performing. The Paulo Virno idea of Glenn Gould. So on stage. The other one is a position of retreat. So an artist who just decides that the world is such a damn mess that the art making is also a practice of retreat, withdrawal. Morandi during World War II and so forth.
Well, in fact, one of the artists wrote you a letter saying that he would not participate in Documenta, correct? So
yeah, I exhibited the letter.
Yes.
I did the letter with his consent because it was about this question of retreating. And so retreat stage, what were the other two positions? Gee, I should have prepared this. This is where you can tell that I'm in my early 60s. Hope. To be in a state of hope. So the interesting thing is when artists are in a state of hope, they are rarely making art. They're usually very busy. And that came to me because it was the middle of the Arab Spring and I couldn't get Wael Shawky on the damn phone. You know, I couldn't get anybody from Egypt on the phone. They were so busy with Tahrir Square and so forth. And so I thought, that's it. You know, the years that the artists are involved in a state of hope, they're generally doing very practical things like creating a Bauhaus or making cups or clothes or something, organizing something. And so it was hope, retreat, stage, and what was the other one? Could somebody remember? Gee, it must be in the guidebook. I would search in the guidebook. Do any of you or do any of the people who are listening remember?
Why don't you talk about something else and I'll go look for the guidebook, okay? I have the small one. I don't have the big one, but.
I have the guidebook, so Julia, who's near me, is gonna
Okay.
look it up. But it must mean something psychoanalytically that I can't remember. So basically what we did was that these four positions from which an artist acts were distributed around the world. So the fourth one was under siege.
Yes.
To be under siege, to feel under siege. So under siege meant that I decided to host part of the Documenta in Kabul and actually in the Bamiyan Valley where the Bamiyan Buddhas had been recently destroyed. And that was a very, very long process to decide to do that, because what do you do in a place that has been liberated and that is from the Taliban regime, but that is currently occupied by the liberators? So, you know, the Canadian soldiers, the Italian soldiers and so on. So it's a very tricky thing to not be part of a occupation force in a way, to normalize occupation. So that took about a year to figure out. And but we did it for two reasons. You know, one was because Alighiero Boetti had his one hotel in Kabul. And the other was that I really wanted to balance this globetrotting business of the Biennales and do the documenta in a place where no international visitor could go, so that it was truly for the local audiences, if it could be, and if that can never happen. And there, you couldn't get a tourist visa, so actually it's been wiped off the map of the Documenta 13, the whole venue, but there were artists, productions, 30 Afghan artists, workshops, traveling back and forth.
Well, and also what I think it did, it changed some of these artists, work, right? Like I think Francisa Lisa's work,
yes.
right, in Afghanistan is deeply indebted to that,
Yes, it predates all of his work in the Middle East. Yes, it's true. Yeah. But also it was very important that there be, a balanced representation of artists. And so it was mainly Afghan artists. And actually they had a whole building in Kassel too. Aside from being all over Kassel, Miriam Ghani and so forth was in the Friedrichianum and so forth. But there was also one whole building that was a kind of connected. And the Bactrian princesses in the, but this is all a little bit, I find it very interesting, but I'm not sure that it makes sense today to think in terms of this so-called exhibition. I'm not 100%.
Well, and that's, I think, my last question before Laura comes in has to do perhaps with this. We can shift. We still have half an hour, so we can talk a lot more about any of these topics. But the last one that I want to introduce is precisely this issue of there's a specific reason why this series, why I called it, 2022, right? The ongoing biennial, right? It's the idea that, does it really make sense to make biennials at this point, right? Like the very structure that biennials rely on, which is this idea of global culture through travel, through transit, through shipping, through, collaboration in various cities around the world, has been really significantly challenged by the pandemic. But it was already being challenged by other aspects before, the collapse of capitalist structures and so on. And so I'm curious how you, both in terms of how you think of these international exhibits that are so large scale, how you have shifted, but also at Castello di Rivoli as a director of an institution, how you have navigated, or how your life has changed and how your thinking has changed in the midst of so many unprecedented political realities and health realities,
Yeah, well, that's spot on. What you said is spot on. There is no answer that is right, and there is no answer that is wrong. Philosophically, my background is in skepticism. So sextus empiricus, and from skepticism, and Deleuze was a skepticist. And I would say that most feminist thinkers are also skepticists in their own way. I mean, for sure, in different ways. Judith Butler in so many thinkers. So I think that skepticism is a self-doubt. I mean, self-doubt is fundamental, especially in Western culture, and not all Western or Northern, global North thinking is skeptical. Actually, the main paradigm is not skeptical. Therefore, the undercurrent, which is very, very important, and which goes through also Friedrich Nietzsche, and which goes certainly through Adorno, and the negative dialectic is fundamentally skepticism. So in being a skeptic, whatever I say, I think is wrong the minute I say it. So whatever I say now to you is certainly wrong the minute that it's been summarized. So to try to navigate that, I think the main danger right now is the over digitalization. I mean, the shift is, and we can see it in the wealth, where the wealth is, I mean, where the money is and so forth. It's always about tracing the money, I guess. So it's all in digitalization right now, which of course is very important. I agree. And it certainly has helped during the pandemic to be able to not just go to the supermarket and buy, or not just buy stuff online, but also explore all these events and things going on through the internet, and thanks to the internet, and certain marginalized groups or thinking have been able to be more in the forefront. So I'm certainly not against the thinking of, say, Legacy Russell or young people that are seeing that as an opportunity, also an emancipatory opportunity. Also, artists, young artists like Tabitha Rezaïr and so on, to trace the background of the digital, even in IFA, binary code and so forth. However, I do think that that there is a risk that there be an alliance in the future between the ecological movements and the hyper digitalization in order to save the planet by making people stay at home and be online all the time, a kind of a matrix risk. I mean, I'm old enough to see that slowly kind of happen. And we all know that that you don't only have Black Lives Matter happen because of the internet, you also have certain people elected, or you also have the storming of the Capitol in the US. So it's a really dangerous moment. And I think that in that sense, if we could not take all those airplanes, the fact of not arriving at monocultures, but arriving at the importance of the return of these periodic exhibitions. But what I was questioning before is the structure of the exhibition format. It's not so much the idea of the event or the festival. I think that they will play a very, very important role in terms of keeping very strong relativistic positions, philosophical positions, and eschewing the risk of a kind of a wrong kind of territorialization. So that's my overall thinking, is that it's very important, and that's why Documenta happened. The reason I did that the way I did was to kind of stop something that was going on, which was that the biennales were going down. They were not anymore supported. They were only attacked as being tourist traps and ways that cities would legitimize themselves touristically. And the art system was moving towards the auction houses and the art fairs. It was the rise of Art Basel and the decline of the Biennale system. And this was because the art fair is a structure more like the internet, where you can put distinct folders, distinct galleries and stuff, and you open one and open the other and go into this and go into that. So structurally, it's closer to the art fair model than it is to the Biennale model. So I thought at the time that I needed to prove that the International Periodic Exhibition was really important. And I think it achieved it. I think it actually gave a new life after a period of decline. And many, many biennales all over the place were born. And I think that's great. That's great. But the word biennale comes from Italian, it comes from the Italian Biennale Venice. The only reason people really like that name is because it gives a sense of order. It's like in when you write music, that it's this first biennale, second biennale, third biennale, fourth biennale. But it's because there's a certain fear that
and in fact, I think so many biennales don't happen every 2 years, but they still call them biennales.
Of course, that's fine. That's fine.
But I'm really glad that we got here in the conversation, because I had an intuition that Laura would be a great respondent for you, and I know that why, because everything you said in the last part of the comments, I think that having, like, being a curator and a senior researcher at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, I think has exposed you, Laura, to all of these dilemmas, right? And the necessity of objects and people looking at those objects, but also keeping a certain skepticism, relativism, and not creating a monoculture, right? I mean, the very premise, even if it has made mistakes, but also your exhibition that you put together really revised its relation to the museum, to wealth, to race and so on. So I think several of the things that Carolyn brought up resonate quite a lot. So I'll let you two talk for like the next 10 minutes and I'll go to the background. And I will be looking at questions from so if you're in the audience, please add your questions or comments. And when I get back in 10 minutes or so, we will start addressing those questions, okay?
Great, well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's already really fascinating conversation, stimulating a lot of thoughts, some of which I've been thinking about, others that are different. But, I think as Pedro already mentioned, this idea of, the physical experience with art, that direct encounter with objects, and then the virtual experience is something that we're all thinking about so much right now, when you're organizing exhibitions, whether it is these, whatever the venue may be. And, I was wondering if you could speak, Carolyn, a little bit more to, as you actually mentioned in this fall's, art forum, I know about, thinking about that physical embodied experience of art. What does that mean to you now? How has your view shifted in what we've all been through because of the pandemic?
Well, that's a very good question. I think I began a little bit to answer it already. I don't really, again, have a clear answer. I mean, I don't think there is, well, before, in my previous answer, I said, I think, a first half, which is that matter matters. Why matter matters is the title of a book of a very important author. So now, after this lockdown, clearly, and which has accelerated a movement which was already happening, the movement of entering into a digital regime. So a digital regime is something very different from before. And entering into that digital regime means actually something that I think Paul Preciado would agree. It actually implies that we are, when we make an exhibition or when we go to a museum, it's not as it was before. It wasn't natural. It's not natural anymore. It's cannot be naturalized, and it's almost like a reperformation of itself. So every exhibition or every biennale or every encounter with a physical art object in the format of exhibition is a theater of itself. And it contains all the exhibitions that were done before in the history of exhibition making, which is a very short history. It's a history that has to do with the bourgeoisie and with the actual founding of the concept of art in Western culture, which is not the same as what it was even in Europe before Western culture. Because before Western culture, there was still humans living, right, in Europe, or what is today Europe. And the ancient Greeks had a mythological thinking, and they certainly had a recursive thinking. It wasn't linear at all, and it wasn't rational at all, except Aristotle kind of tried to start it. But there's no word for art. There's only the word techne, which means craft. So art as we know it is an invention, as we use it in the global art world, is an invention of the Enlightenment. When there was a split that was made in Europe between useful craft and useless craft. And the useless craft was the so-called art, the product of the genius, and what was the useful laborer, the bourgeois, was supposed to do on the weekend, read poetry, read novels, and look at art and listen to concerts. So it was non-functional according to the bourgeois. And that is one of the fundamental aspects of our definition still today of what is art, that it doesn't have a purpose. But all over the world, and even in Europe, until the 18th century, that was not the definition, that was not the craft of making things creatively, let's say. They always had a purpose or a function. for example, illustrating the stories of the cross in Christian religion, you know, or some sort of function, like in a garden or in a something. So now, and exhibitions were born in the basically in the early 1800s. So when we look at this history of 2 centuries of exhibition making and of museum, there were no museums. I mean, the concept of the museum is a modern Western concept. Now, I completely disagree with destroying museums because they are a Western modern concept. I do not think that the museum is only a repository for colonial theft. No, I don't think so. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci legitimately sold the Mona Lisa to the French. We can't do a restitution claim in Italy for the Mona Lisa because the Mona Lisa was sold. He was living in France and working for François Ier, and it was his choice. And he made it there. He even painted it in France. So no restitution case possible for the Mona Lisa. Other things, of course, there are restitution cases which should happen, which have to do with theft done during the Napoleonic era from Italian churches and so forth. So there are lots of things that should be restituted. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I think that if we understand that the museum is a modern construction, we can decide, well, do we want to get rid of it, you know, or do we want to keep it as a reperformation of itself? And I believe that that's the case. I mean, I believe that restitution processes need to continue, need to go on. Many things, you know, but it's happening. Like the Peabody Museum in Harvard has given back to indigenous communities, I don't know, maybe 20,000 objects already that have been buried, some of them and so forth, as they should properly be buried. So, but I believe that the process now that we need to make is both, of course, opening the narratives and rewriting the narratives, of course, that's been going on for the last 30 years, actually started in Australia, in my view. It started very clearly in post-colonial contexts where there were issues of guilt, maybe, and so forth, embedded, and knowledges that the curators had and so forth. So very interesting processes began in the early 2000s or actually in the 1990s or 1980s even, with Australia. But now it became a global question. And I think it's very, very important that this happens, that this process of restitution happens in many cases, and this process of rewriting canons happens, that the plurality of narratives happen. But it would be catastrophic if we canceled the narrative that is set in place originally in those museums, because the museum is not a neutral container. It is a container that was constructed by the self-same generation that constructed the history of art according to Western canon, which is that generation of Winkelmann. So why in the world would we deny that story in the structure that was made in parallel to Winkelmann? But what we can do is reperform it with critical thinking and tell that story, you know, and then—
Absolutely.
Exactly. And so it's very important what needs to be done in museums, I think. And so to go back to the digital, the one mistake that we sometimes make is that we make a split between so-called physical objects and materials and the so-called online world. And young people don't do that, but my generation does that still. And I disagree. You know, our mind and our experience is a continuity of, I mean, our emotions material? Yes, in a way, they're hormones that are in they're hormones that are shooting from my brain to in my body, and dopamine and pheromones that are going. But are they really that material? So there's no distinction between. I think everything is material. Everything has matter, even on a quantum level. So certainly everything that the damn digital age is doing to overheat the world. I mean, it's not airplanes, but it's huge amounts of cooling structures that need to be set in place. And they're the ones who are polluting right now, not the airplanes, because they're not flying. So what's polluting is all this damn cooling of all the huge cloud, which is not in the cloud, but on the desert and under the oceans and so forth. So of course, everything is material. At the same time, everything is immaterial because, you know, I could, I guess, if I was small enough, pass right through this screen. You know, all the little subatomic particles would just go right through this screen. So there's no, it's wrong to see it as a binary, but young people know that much better than I can tell. They know that and they say that. But I do think at the same time as everything is material and everything is immaterial, things get slightly consolidated. And one of the problems I see with the digital generations of people is that they tend to forget a little bit phenomenological studies and the phenomenology of the experience of the body moving through space. So they will sometimes organize an exhibition intellectually by saying, I want to put this next to this, next to this, next to this, because of these relations that I want to make. But then when you put it in the physical space, it doesn't have anything to do with the time of your body walking from one thing to another and so forth. So I think that there should be workshops for training the young curators in the phenomenology of experience.
Absolutely. I think that what you said is something that the exhibition that I organized with a wonderful team of people across the Metropolitan Museum. I certainly don't want to take exclusive credit for that, but we were meant to open last March, you know, in this whole pre-COVID world was the way the entire exhibition was conceived. We were halfway through installation when we had to shut down. But then we opened when the museum reopened in August. And so during that period of time for us was, 5.5 months when we were closed, we were challenged to really try to, increase our digital presence to reach the people who wouldn't be able to physically make it to see the exhibition in new ways. And ways that, of course, we were conceiving, at home on our own computers. But for me, at least, that experience of reopening at the end of August and of seeing people and being, myself too, physically in the space, moving through the space, seeing those kinds of relationships between objects that you can only get fully, with a peripheral vision, not just a flat screen, I think has really kind of heightened those senses. And I know we want to move on and open up as well to questions from the audience, but I think just one other thing I thought I would just kind of throw out there too is as you mentioned at the beginning, this concept of nonlinear time. And that's another, for me, experience that I feel has really, we're in this moment where we're so conscious of our present, of this strange sense of time that we're living through, kind of collapsed, blurred days, but that digital sphere that feels like the future. At the same time, I think a lot of us are thinking so much about past precedent, about whether in the United States it was, the 1918 flu epidemic, or, these other kinds of, thinking about precedent. So I think that's an interesting thing of, that's something that we were working with some in making the Met, thinking about, these different juxtaposing, contemporary objects with historical objects in different kinds of ways. But that's something that I'm interested in your take on what you think we may see next in the exhibition world, in terms of thinking about past, present, future, now that we've all lived through, still living through this pandemic experience?
Well, I don't know. I mean, what I'm mainly waiting for is to see what you people will do. I mean, I'm on my way out. I mean, I'm 63, and of course I can do other exhibitions, but right now I'm very involved in the museum, and incorporating the Cerruti collection in the Contemporary Art Museum is a big move in terms of what you're talking about, nonlinear time and so forth. So I really can't give you an answer in terms of large international exhibitions and how they should be made. But what I do know is that we have to resist or find another way to answer, to reply to the request for numbers. Now, when we were doing exhibitions in the physical space only, you had to have like 1 million visitors a year or 100,000 for that exhibition or whatever. And there was always this resisting the fact that they wanted the blockbuster powers that be or funders wanted blockbuster exhibitions. Now we're in a much more dangerous moment, much more dangerous. I don't know if you've seen that movie, The Circle. It's kind of a bad movie, but it's about the digital shift. Anyway, this protagonist, she wears this camera, you know, it's like 10 years ago or something, I don't know. And she wears this camera all day long to share her life with everybody. And so she's in the bathroom brushing her teeth and all that. And she goes on a kayak in the bay, San Francisco Bay, without her camera. And then she gets accused the day after of being a horrible elitist because she didn't share her experience in the kayak in the San Francisco Bay with all the people, the millions of people who were connected to her. And this is very dangerous because now we're not looking at funders and sponsors saying you need to have 100,000 in an exhibition or 200,000. We need to have 1 million hits, you know, 1 million people. But what is that million people seeing on the social media or of that exhibition or on the 3D virtual thing? By the way, in contemporary art, you can't even begin to do a 3D virtual tour of a show because they'll hit you with a camera, the artist, in the sense that because the medium is the message, you absolutely cannot translate the artwork from one medium. If it's got to be dirt, it's dirt. This has got to be on the internet or a user-based virtual object. It's made as a user-based virtual object. Can't just translate it. So even that operation that they're asking us to do with historical artifacts is impossible in the contemporary sphere. But we're at a moment where the attention economy, I mean, how the economy works is about attention now, and the money is connected with attention. So we've just passed into a much more dangerous moment in terms of artistic research, because nobody wants to be accused of being an elitist. Nobody wants to be accused of not sharing and not caring about education and sharing knowledge. I mean, that's why we're in this and we're not running Sotheby's or Christie's. The reason, Laura, is because we want to share with people.
Absolutely.
And it has something to do with that. But so even though I don't want to be accused of not wanting to share with a lot of people, I understand that we might be 1 centimeter from artistic practices where a work will be done for one person, like a ritual on top of a mountain, punto, you know, just quote unquote, fuck it all, unquote. And I think that we cannot stop that if the people, because making art in its broad sense, not in its enlightenment sense, is like a human need, and humans, and also, and for that matter, also bees. And I've argued that in my documenta. And I think someone should do the history of the architecture of bees, beehives and so on. That's not been done. There's so much work to be done in artistic practices in non-human communities. But let's leave that aside for a moment and say, since it's quite universal, this thing, I mean, the fact that we would be pigeonholed in needing to do things that would be acceptable according to an attention economy is very dangerous.
There's a good number of comments and questions in the Q&A, but also in terms of the conversation you two were having, there's a very, I think, rich comment by one of our audience members, Minos Plato, who has joined our sessions before. And he says, you know, that he missed Documenta 13, but became obsessed with it after the fact, mainly through the lens of publications. But so that when he visited Documenta 14 in 2017, he went on a search for the traces as if in ancient ruins, right? So he walked through the area where the PRE, piece was, and so on. So the question to you is, there's 2 questions. One is whether you know of any traces that still remain, and the other has to do with the text by Enrique Villamatas, the idea of Cásil no invita a la lógica, if you could comment on it. I will only add that I actually did with And, I was part of the collective that did a project for Documenta. And one of the works that Renee, Irene, and Renee, Gabriela, and Irene Anastas really initiated through this collective was the planting of this garden. There were all kinds of gardenings. They lived there for the whole 100 days. And so I haven't gone back to see if the garden's still alive, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of the community that they helped create is still actively gardening. But
Yeah.
so I don't know if you wanted to add to this idea of an archaeology of the document.
Well, for sure, one piece exists, which is, well, two pieces that are very visible exist. One is the Giuseppe Pennone tree, because the citizens of Kassel actually chipped together the money, like crowdfunding, and acquired it. And it's now, as often, it's quite classic and normal that something from a previous documenta remains. You can see those remains around Kassel of my previous ones, not even mine from way before. So that remains. There's another piece that's a bit hidden near the river after the Pierre compost area, after the urban, some of the gardens that Renee and Irene did. There was a Chinese restaurant. If you go to the left from the Chinese restaurant, still must be there in the middle of the park, which is the weirdest thing, that there's this Chinese restaurant in the middle of the Auer Park. I don't know how it happened, but it's there. And that has to do with Enrique Villamatas, which I'll tell you in a minute. But if you go past China, after the compost, past the Chinese restaurant to the left towards the river, there's a place where Akram Zaatari buried the Arab Image Foundation images. I mean, he basically created a kind of a time capsule and copies. I don't think they were the only ones, but one full set of the Arab Image Foundation images from Beirut were buried. So like a time capsule to be opened by some archaeologist in the future. So that is a little secret that I think I just revealed, and I hope people don't start digging out there right now, because it's supposed to stay for a lot longer. There are traces in the archive of the Documenta. I left some letters with a request that they not be opened for, I think, either 10 or 15 years. It's coming up soon. So there are some letters that I left with certain things said about time, and they're undisclosed. So until 2022. So by about that time, I hope somebody will do a thesis on it and they can open those letters. The unwilling traces, I would say that of course there are unintentional traces all over the place, precisely because of what you just said. I mean, there was a lot of gardening and a lot of planting going on in that Documenta. And there was also the German artist, the one who made the garden for the butterflies outside of the Documenta Halle, where the audience was the butterflies. So she planted plants that the other butterflies from the region particularly like. And I'm sure that many seeds have been, not spontaneously grown, and that's changed the area for sure. That I think, but those are the most obvious thing, I think, the gardens. Maybe in the structure of the relationship between Documenta and the people of Kassel, there was a change, because instead of having this parachuted exhibition that was kind of rejected by the local community, we created these worldly companions as an education project. And basically anybody who was in Kassel, like a baker or a teacher or a student or a homeless or anyone, could become a guide for the Documenta. And so we made a university for the worldly companions, and they were trained, and many artists went and explained their works and so on. But at the same time, they were encouraged to mix their own personal life and experience and knowledge with the story of the works in the exhibition. So that created a very non-conformist kind of educational system that I'm sure left traces in those 100 worldly companions who then lived later. So that's the question. You asked me if there was something left. Well, yeah. I can tell you that in Kabul, there's things left, For example, Giuseppe Pennone gifted to the Baghe Babur Gardens, to the city of Kabul, he gifted a tree, a beautiful sculpture in in marble that's kind of like a cylinder that's propping up a tree that was leaning, and that was a young tree growing. So what happens is that as the young tree grows, and it's already grown 10 more years, it grows, it doesn't fall, lean more and more, it grows. It's like propping up in a garden. And so it will probably be there 100 years from now, and it was gifted. So that's also very interesting how the artists, you know, operate, how they operate very freely. And that certainly has remained. Things from materials from Afghanistan remain, for example, in some of this. Well, anyway, there's many stories to tell, many stories. But I did that answer the question?
Yes, I think so. And I mean, I also, I'll try to interweave, since I don't want to keep you too long. I'll interweave some of the various of the questions. There's questions and comments from Usha Sejarim. There's several people loved your comment of the useless craft, like reminding us of that history, right? Of how art even came about in the West. But also, Miguel Rojas wanted you to talk a little bit more about the human, non-human in curatorial practice in general. But several of the comments have to do with also the role of criticism. You know, like I think people are really appreciating how you're you bring in an intellectual dimension that I think is often, you know, not there. And I think perhaps one way to interweave it is also for you to talk about more. So, for example, one of the questions is about the proliferation of these online digital journals that are really just promotional and not really art criticism, you know. And I remember when you did Documenta, there was this really intensive publication accompaniment, right? Where an artist would be in conversation with a critic or someone, I think, maybe you can remind people how it worked, that who was invited to be in conversation with each artist, because I still find those to be incredible resources for people, you know, long after Documenta happened.
That's the 100 notes. I think you're talking about the 100 notes, 100 thoughts. Some were conversations, but some were not. They were just essays. That's speaking about Judith Butler, we published a beautiful essay of hers on the concept of love in Hegel, actually, which then was part of subsequent things. But Donna Haraway, I mean, this kind of mixes both subjects. Donna Haraway was one of my consultants, how do you say, advisors. As was Michael Tausig and many other people who were a lot younger in 2012. Anyway, Donna was very important to me. And in terms of the human and non-human question, it was fundamental. And I think, I mean, I may be mistaken, but there's a student from Paris who's doing a thesis on this. I do think that within the contemporary art world, Donna Haraway kind of became a subject and someone read after the Documenta 13. So it did have a big impact on what was later the whole. I also published a notebook of Jill Bennett called The Anthropocene. And I think it was one of the first times the term Anthropocene was used in the art community. It was used in, of course, other like geology worlds, but it hadn't yet become a subject matter. I mean, I think a year later they did something at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt on the Anthropocene. So those topics kind of came into our discussions a lot through those 100 notes, 100 thoughts. The last notebook was Karen Barad on the fact that there's nothing is empty. That was a beautiful one. And Donna published the notebook, which was an essay around, the seeds. And it became the first chapter of one of her later books. So then I basically, I'm doing self-promotion by saying, I agree with you, that the 100 notes, 100 thoughts became lots of different things that we later really developed. On hospitality, well, Claire Pentecost and did a notebook with Brown Compost, but there were many things from all over the world that were done. And I think you're asking me what they were. Well, they were a process. In other words, I didn't know what I thought, and I wanted to make a chain where you wouldn't commission all these essays for the catalog at the end, and nobody knows what the other people wrote, but you would commission them one at a time, and whoever was writing could read all of the notebooks that were already there. So it was a little bit like a response, and I saw it as a guirlanda, and they all are collected in the book of books. So at the end, except for one, Daniel Heller-Roazen, who teaches Italian or something in Princeton, he wrote a notebook about when you should hold your tongue. And that was a very important notebook. And so he didn't allow it to be republished in the book of books. The book of books.
Talk about holding the tongue.
There was a notebook speaking about the archaeology of the digital. Erkki Kurianiemi, he died shortly thereafter. There were, Peter Gallison and William Kendrick, Jalal Tufik, of course. Vandana Shiva did a really beautiful one. Alejandro Jodorowsky on reading cards. I mean, I could just, and then you asked me about the book, Castle no invita a la lógica. Which I'll tell you now about. There was Sueli Rolnick did something, Griselda Pollock in terms of something else, but Alexander Kluge. Let me just think. Well, Hans did something with Edouard Glissant, on Edouard Glissant, of course. But, Sonala Ibrahim, the Egyptian novelist, did a beautiful short novel that was 3 pages long. Jimmy Durham, Echo, speaking about material, I would read the Jimmy Durham notebook on material, Laura. That would be a great notebook to read. You can actually buy them online, and Eduardo Viveros de Castro did a beautiful one on the opposite of Western perspective. And then Ayel Weissman did a beautiful one on forensic architecture, Brian Holmes.
Well, it's a beautiful paradox too, Carolyn, of like you were describing it as a guirlanda, and yet it's so non-linear also, like it's linear and non-linear,
Yeah, it absolutely is. And there was this Chinese restaurant, as I said, in the park. And basically, Chus Martinez, who worked very closely with me, she really wanted literature to be part of the documenta as well. And I wonder if my dog is going to get into this. Here's the dog. Yes. So no, he was wanting to get up. The dog Darcy has to do with Donna Haraway, because when I was in Sydney working on the Sydney Biennial, I found the book on dogs and multi-species coevolution, which was a small manifesto, and it had just come out, and that's how I got to Donna. And so it didn't come from any other place than Darcy. So that said, l'autore del romanzo. So anyway, Chus wanted to bring novels and literature to give a different dimension of time, and it was all connected with living in Kassel. We wanted to stay in Kassel and have artists stay and live. So we created these residencies for novelists, and novelists didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to give a lecture. They didn't have to produce or perform. They only had to sit at a certain table in the Chinese restaurant at the back of the park and talk with people who would come. Si chiama Castle non invita alla logica. È tradotto anche in italiano. Ecco, I'm trying to find the year of the publication of that book. Yeah, so, but you may find that out when it came out, the book of Enrique Villamatas. But anyway, Enrique was 2014, they tell me, the young people tell me, 2014. So Enrique was invited in this sense to sit in the Chinese restaurant. And that's what he did. He sat in the Chinese restaurant. And when the exhibition was not up, he was walking around, was not open to the public. He was walking around and meeting people and seeing people. And I didn't ask him to write a novel about the Documenta 13. And I was very happy that it did happen, because I think it's the best text about Documenta 13 that exists. There's no art critic that really, I think, got it as well as, at least the way that Enrique told the story of the different works that he chose to focus on was absolutely, I think, perfect. And so I learned a lot from that book. And I have to say, the woman in the red dress at the beginning who goes to ask him to come to Kassel is actually Chus. And it's actually true that I only met him towards the end of his residency because I was very busy. And he wrote this horrible thing where, well, he wrote during the whole novel that he thought I didn't exist, that there was not this Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev. But I was just working. I was always working. And he was going and enjoying himself. So he thought I didn't exist. Then at the end we meet, and I was just rushing to a meeting or something, but he writes this horrible thing in the novel, which is, that I looked at him, from the head to the toes, and basically dismissed him as like something totally uninteresting, and it offended him. So that's the only thing I would disagree with. I was actually just intimidated, by this great novelist, and I really actually liked the book so much. But there isn't much to tell you, except that it was not planned. It came spontaneously from Enrique, and I think it's one of his best novels.
Well, I think there's not that many of these international exhibitions that have ended with a fantastic novel, and especially with your anecdote around it and narrating it, putting it in a lived perspective. Well, thanks so much for spending all this time with us, Carolyn, and it's been really great. And thanks also, Laura, for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.